Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Junior English. We now turn to page 907 of your hymnal, and we are going to now spend a few minutes with Langston Hughes' classic little poem, Refugee in America. Now, of course, for this poem to make much sense, we have to know the word refugee. So let's go ahead and write that word down at level 1. Let's define it for a moment so that we can be sure that we understand how a title can be then, in many ways, the forecast of what is, as you've counted it already at 2B, an 8-line offering. One of the things, let's just jump to 2B for a moment. One of the things that I like to point out about these poems of Langston Hughes that we're looking at is that you can do a lot and say a lot as an artist in just a few lines. And Langston Hughes is a classic example of this, along with immediately we think at 3A, don't we, of someone like Emily Dickinson, success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. To comprehend a nectar requires sorest need. You'll maybe remember some of the poems that we were working with earlier with Emily Dickinson. Doesn't have to be long to be provocative. What is a refugee? Well, let's begin with the word dislocate. Dislocate. That is to say, we are not, if we're a refugee, we are not home. We are not home. We are somehow other, separate, foreign, often associated with understandings of lonely, unable to feel in some ways connected. In your senior year, when we study the 1611 King James Version of the Bible as a classic work of English literature, we'll study in the Bible the book of Psalms, and we'll study a famous psalm called 137, where there's dislocation. Those refugees, those in exile, are unable to return to Jerusalem, to Zion, and they are taunted by their captors to sing songs. It's very possible that Psalm 137 is in Langston Hughes' mind as he sits down to write this poem, Refugee in America. Now, let's go ahead and say it out loud one more time. We're going to get a first-person speaker in this poem, I, me, mine. But we're going to ask, who is the refugee? Let's read the poem. Refugee in America. I'm reading with you on page 907. There are words like freedom, sweet and wonderful to say. On my heart strings freedom sings all day, every day. There are words like liberty that almost make me cry. If you had known what I knew, you would know why. Now, again, this is a small, brief poem, but this poem is going to challenge us, no question. But let's begin at 2B for just a moment and identify that we have a 2-stanza poem. Do we not? Notice the structure. Write it down at 2B really quickly. We have stanza 1 of 4 lines, stanza 2 of 4 lines. As a 3A observation, notice that you have something very similar to Dream Variations, the poem that we just worked with on the effacing page on 906. Very similar happening here, where you're going to have almost like a restatement of a kind in the second stanza of what we saw in the first stanza. Again, Hughes, very influenced by the blues and jazz of his day, so you're going to have like this repetition of a kind. Of course, the power of the poem starts in that title. What would it be like to live in America but not feel like you were American? What would it be like to feel like you were never going to actually receive the very things that are so celebrated in our culture's Magna Carta, the most precious documents we have? Of course, let's say it now. We have to write it down at 3A, as we already are thinking about relationship to other titles. Standing behind this document has to be, of course, that most precious of all statements from 1775, correct? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are what? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. With that in mind, let's work now level 1, summary, and of course level 2A, themes, messages. There are words like, and then notice the italicized, freedom, he begins, sweet and wonderful to say. On my heartstrings, freedom sings, or we could say even plays, all day, every day. Go ahead and summarize at level 1. What exactly is it that he is saying here? Many have said, freedom, sweet, wonderful, freedom sings all day, every day. The quest for freedom, and the way in which the word itself is a precious word in our culture. I think sometimes we overlook this because it sounds so cliche-driven. But let's write it in our notes nonetheless, and at 3B we'll obviously have to ask a personal question about it. Why is freedom such a precious word? What does the word freedom even mean to you? We're again just working level 1, so we're just summarizing. You could summarize the first stanza by one of the things that he always thinks about, he says. He always is considering, is this amazing, this sweet, this wonderful word, freedom. Of course, let's point out, and we'll have to say it as we hit level 2, and we begin to think about major themes and messages. Notice the last word of that second line is the word to say, right? There are words like freedom, sweet, and wonderful to say. In other words, you can see that there's a political subversive element to this poem that says, as Americans, we have a tendency to talk about things that we don't always necessarily get to experience. Talk about them, say, speak the words. Right. The second stanza. Let's work at level 1. There are words like liberty that, notice the word almost make me cry. If you had known what I knew, you would know why. Go ahead and summarize at level 1. What do you think it is that he's saying here? Obviously, we're going to talk at level 2A here in a moment about themes, messages. Notice there's a different word. He doesn't use the word freedom a second time. He rather uses the word liberty. As your sidebar tells you, liberty is the condition of being free from control by others. And why the word almost makes me cry. And who is the word? What is the antecedent to the pronoun you in line 7-8? If you had known what I knew, you would know why. Why what? Why liberty almost makes me cry. Some readers of this poem have pointed out at level 1, summary level of reading, that in the first stanza we say, let me tell you what I love most, freedom. In the second stanza, let me tell you why I'm so sad when I have to think about freedom and liberty. There are certain experiences that limit my love of the word, my joy of the word, because I realize that maybe there is a difference between theory and praxis. There's a difference between hoping and fulfilling a dream. All right, let's jump to level 2A really quickly and understand this poem as, in fact, a powerful political statement. Notice, any American of any skin color would read the first stanza and say, you bet. Freedom is sweet and wonderful to say. Freedom is what our hearts are always singing about. We are, in fact, we say it, the land of the free and the home of the brave, right? The idea here in the first stanza is, if you wanted to reduce the American dream to 4 lines, it is this. There are words like freedom, sweet and wonderful to say. On my heartstrings, freedom sings all day, every day. There it is. If you had to reduce everything that we've said about the American experience in our class together, it's assumed right there in 4 lines. What does it mean to be an American? You sing about freedom all the time. You speak it all the time. You think it all the time. Freedom. It's foundational to who we are as people, that we call ourselves Americans. Think about, then, the second stanza. What do we call it? Interestingly, we don't call it the Statue of Freedom. We call it the Statue of Liberty. Liberty, of course, is a different word from freedom. But question, how is freedom and liberty synonymous for you or different for you? This is a 3B question that we'll come back to here in a bit. But notice when liberty is raised, the word, it seems as if it almost makes the speaker cry. Notice the speaker doesn't say, let me tell you why. The speaker rather says, if you knew what I knew, you would know why. So if the first stanza is a line that every American can resonate with, you bet. We talk about freedom all the time because it's central to who we are. The second stanza suggests, now we're working at 2A, right? The second stanza suggests there are some people who don't experience liberty, even though they're constantly thinking about freedom. Another possible theme message here is the radical distinction between, on the one hand, freedom as a concept, and on the other hand, liberty as an actual activity of citizens. Another major message or theme, and this is, of course, the politically subversive nature of a little simple poem like this. The language so sing-songy. It's almost like you have a tendency to overlook this until you begin to look beneath the epidermal level at level 2. Notice this poem is suggesting there is something wrong with America. There's something wrong with a culture that teaches its children to love the word freedom, to speak the word freedom, while at the same time not appropriating the potentiality of liberty. There's something fundamentally wrong with that. Of course, at 2B, we have to ask about these pronouns. Who is the me speaking? Who is the my speaking? For example, in line 3. And then who is the you who can't quite understand? Who might say, what are you talking about? How is it possible that hearing the word liberty can almost make you cry? What are you talking about? Everyone knows what it means to have liberty, right? It is one of those rights that Thomas Jefferson speaks about in the Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Well, of course, many readers of this poem, as they look at the work of Langston Hughes, understand that in the first stanza, you could argue that the my of line 3 is all Americans. All Americans love to sing and to talk about freedom. But notice the shift in the second stanza, that the me who almost cries when hearing the word liberty is going to be those disenfranchised Americans. Maybe people of color, maybe people who have been maligned in some way because of their economic situation or their religious situation or any number of other reasons why. We might say gender. It is compelling to realize that there are huge parts of Americans, of the America collective, who cannot fully enjoy the liberties that freedom promises. But notice, the speaker of the poem doesn't tell us why. The speaker of the poem only says, if you knew what I knew, you would know why. Now let's go ahead and point this out. What a brilliant, brilliant little poem to suggest that there are some of us who do not yet completely comprehend or understand the challenges of others of us. Wow, let's write that down. That's a provocative observation. The idea that there are some of us who live and have all of the blessings, we might say, and all of the joys of a certain kind of lifestyle, and we do not understand that there are other people who do not get to live with that level of freedom, of liberty. And in the process, of course, there's a different experience of being an American. I mean, one way I've tried to point this out to students is to say, if you had been born a crack baby under a bridge in Atlanta, you would be a different you than you are right now. Am I right or am I right? You'd see the world differently. You'd think about the world differently, and you might think about the words freedom and liberty differently as well. If you were an individual, for example, who was not given any of the opportunities of education and all that is afforded by that, you may have a completely different view of the word freedom and liberty. Notice how the poem begins with great joy and ends with crying and tears. Compelling juxtaposition as well between the two. Almost Hegelian-like, as we have talked about it in other lectures, where you have the thesis and then you have its complete opposite, the antithesis, with the possibility, we hope, maybe of some synthesis. In other words, some resolution. Notice the interesting lack of resolution in this poem, but maybe the hope of it. In other words, the obvious follow-up is, why don't you tell me what it is I don't know, so that I maybe can share in your tears, or I can share in your quest for not just talking about freedom, but liberty. And it seems to me that this is one of the marvels of Langston Hughes. He set in motion the idea that this is the compelling role that artists can play. They can say, can I tell you what it's like to be something you have never known? Can I tell you what it's like to be a person of color? Can I tell you what it's like to be a person of poverty? Can I tell you what it's like to be a person who is marginalized because of religion? Can I tell you what that is like? Can I show you what that is like? And I'll do that through my art. I'll do that through my words, through my drawings, through my painting, through my sculpting, through my dance, whatever that is that's artistic. And in the process of coming to terms with that, we make a better America. We make an America where more people get to experience liberty, while we all sing songs about freedom. All right, let's jump to 3A really quickly. We want to compare or relate this to other titles. Obviously, we've already studied 3 other in our class together, 3 other Langston Hughes poems, offerings, A Negro Speaks of Rivers, I Too, and Dream Variations on the effacing page 906. How do you see this poem fitting in with all of those other 3 poems? Hopefully you're beginning to kind of get a sense of the work, the range, we might say, of the great Langston Hughes, the genius Langston Hughes. What are for you the films that best represent this notion that you can long for something, freedom, but not actually experience it, liberty, because of any number of things that are holding us back? Some of you will immediately write down, of course, Frederick Douglass and the lines that we've studied already of Frederick Douglass and his observation that if you are uneducated, you are a slave. You are imprisoned in ignorance, and therefore you cannot be free. Some of us will maybe want to consider the great Martin Luther King Jr. and his observations as well, that if you show bias towards another and mistreat another, you yourself are the one who in fact is being enslaved. You are the one who is in fact being most damaged. Which is why MLK said that the one who is being abused has a moral obligation to the one who is the abuser, if in fact we believe in love. What is for you your favorite song on your playlist of freedom? What is for you your favorite song about liberty? Freedom and liberty as being central ideas to who we are. Since we're there, let's jump to 3B. Do you make a distinction between these 2 concepts, freedom and liberty? Do you think of yourself as free? Do you experience this kind of situation where We talk about freedom, but we often don't experience liberty. I once had a junior that said, dude, this is totally what I get to live with at home. I dream of freedom. Being away from the thumb of my parents, free to do whatever I want, but I worry if I'll ever know liberty. Jumping back to 3a, you'll maybe remember that opening line of Rousseau's classic social contract. Man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. One of the classic first lines of any classic text. Of course, let's ask this question now in conclusion at 3b. What are your thoughts about America? Do you feel like we are the land of the free? Do you feel like everyone has equal chance at liberty? Do you feel like, to quote the poem, that if you had known what others knew, then you would also cry when you heard the word liberty? Do you have, again, this is 3b, this is a personal observation, do you have a moral obligation to help others find their freedom, to gain their liberty? And the ways in which that can happen in little subtle ways for you to be able to practice freedom without infringing on other people's liberties as well. The challenge, of course, in a democracy is for us to all cohabitate. Of course, finally, let's point it out, it's the compelling notion of the word refugee in America. Langston Hughes is pointing out that many, many blacks feel as if they do not belong in a culture that celebrates the word freedom all the time. Why? Because they don't understand how they ever can get to actually experience liberty. We think as something, as we say, it's simple.